morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My time's up, so thanks for listening. I want to particularly applaud the patients who are here, physicians who are patients, and patients who are patients. And God bless, you know, it's really terrific for you to be here. We couldn't do any of these things I'm going to show you without you, so you're very much appreciated. I've listed up here my potential conflicts of interest with support from for-profit institutions. And I want to talk about breakthroughs and futurescapes. And I'm thinking in the past decade or even more recently that we have had major breakthroughs in science that allow us to identify new targets for therapy, and some of those have come to pass and have the promise of better care for people with lupus. And those are our appreciation of the importance of the innate immune system. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of detail. The problem of chronic oxidative damage, which I've been thinking might account for the fact that about 25% of people with active lupus at any given time do not have a positive ANA at a time the disease is active. So it seems to me there must be something else going on that's prolonging inflammation and perpetuating inflammation, maybe after autoantibodies are no longer major players in some people. Genetics and epigenetics, which we've just heard elegantly described, and I will delete those slides when I get there to make this shorter. The understanding of how a B cell develops, where it goes, what subsets are and how they function has been absolutely critical. There's been identification of new T cell subsets as well, and many other advances. These are my favorites, and so I listed them. Now, that has resulted and led to some successful therapeutic breakthroughs, and those include the emergence of mycophenolate mofetil for the treatment of lupus and the successful trials with anti-BAFF BLIS that I'm going to discuss briefly for you. This is a diagram I like very much from Peggy Crow in the New England Journal of Medicine, and we knew for some period of time that what's on your left-hand side of the slide was very important, and that's an antigen-presenting dendritic type cell activating T cells that make gamma interferon, and through IL-12 they become Th1s, and through other cytokines they become Th17s, and we've known that, and they activate B cells to make autoantibodies, and in the cells are listed some of the genes that Lindsay talked about that are important in the dysfunction of these cells in people with lupus. And we knew that immune complexes are formed here in the center by binding of antigen by these antibodies. And we didn't understand until recently how very involved the whole right side of the panel is. And the right side of the panel shows the innate immune system, starting with this myeloid dendritic cell that makes a lot of interferon alpha, which we now know is a key signature for some people that have SLE. And neutrophils, which we heard a lot about yesterday, seem to be abnormal in lupus and may be sources of interferon alpha. And the monocyte macrophage and some of the relevant genes there that clears immune complexes and apoptotic cells appear in the left. And now we know that there's just a big circle in these cells. And in fact, the immune complexes and the antigens they carry particularly are able to bind to toll-like receptors in this dendritic cell on the top right panel here, and they're able to make this whole business of autoantibody production go forward. So our primitive innate immune system that protects us from infection is quite intimately involved in also predisposing and perpetuating us to autoimmune responses. And one of my favorite pieces of work that proves this point, in my opinion, is from Ann Davidson's lab, and the senior author is Dr. Schiffer here. And this shows on the right what happens to cells excuse me, hit the wrong thing. What happens to cells over here in the right panel? What happens in the kidney as disease develops? So here, the investigators have taken advantage of a mouse that is genetically destined to develop lupus nephritis. So when the mouse is young, it has no nephritis, and on the left there is all the blue, meaning that genes in the kidney are not upregulated very much. And then in that second panel here, where things start to turn red, that's when proteinuria begins and nephritis begins, and you see all these genes that are upregulated at that time. The investigators then come in with treatment, and they turn off that gene display in that third panel there, where it goes back to blue. And the therapy they use is cyclophosphamide, which we heard a lot about this morning, CTLA-4 Ig, abatacept, and anti-CD154 ligand, which has also had a history in lupus. And you see that they turn down, and then the mice escape from the control, the treatment stopped, and you see the genes turning on again. Over on the left-hand panel, I've put a red plus mark wherever the major source of that protein product is a monocyte or dendritic cell. And look how many of them in the early disease come from this innate immune system. So across the title there, I've listed the stages that were identified. The first thing that happens in the kidney is antibody deposits and complements fixed. The next thing that happens is endothelial cell activation and macrophage activation. Those are the next steps. After that, in the hilum comes in lymphocytes and other inflammatory cells like monocytes from the circulation, and those eventually find their way to the glomerulus and periglomerular areas. So the first thing activated after the immune complex damage occurs are the cells of the innate immune system. Now, could that be used to treat disease? So here's an example that it can be. This is still in the mouse model, and over here on the left panel is damage to glomerulus on top, antibody and glomerulus in the top two panels. In the bottom panel that's green there is the complement fixation. And if the mouse is treated with an oligonucleotide, over here on the two panels, and one of them inhibits TLR7 and one of them inhibits TLR7 and 9. So these are inhibitors of activation of the innate immune system, although toll-like receptors are also present on B cells. And what happens there is you don't get antibody and complement deposition. So you can protect this mouse from lupus nephritis by interfering with toll-like receptor activation. Does this have anything to do with humans? Well, I've picked an example. There's several examples, but this is urinary excretion of tweak. Tweak is, I just am having trouble with this. Tweak is TNF-related weak inducer of apoptosis, and the levels correlate with the activity of lupus nephritis. So tweak, the main source of soluble tweak is monocytes and macrophages, the innate immune system. And once tweak is produced, it induces more chemokines and cytokines that activate more monocytes and lymphocytes. And so here you see on the left panel levels of tweak in people who do not have active lupus nephritis on the left, and on the right levels of urinary tweak in patients who do have active lupus nephritis. And in the right-hand panel, on the bottom, the renal SLEDAI score for active renal disease is going up as you go to the right, and the excretion of urinary tweak is going up also. There are other urine biomarkers. You'll see it's not perfect, and there are people that have normal levels of tweak who are getting worse renal disease. But the idea is that we can see what's happening in the kidney itself by some of these new recent methods. Now, I want to talk a little bit about oxidative damage because we've been interested in that and its importance in causing accelerated atherosclerosis in people that have lupus. So I call this the dark side of oxygen, and it's based on an article by Kay Davies. So we have a single oxygen molecule there in the red has a free electron that isn't matched, isn't paired, and O2 has 2 electrons. Those can be damaging. They're supposed to be taken up in mitochondria and made into water. And if that process were perfect, we wouldn't have oxidative damage. However, during the process, you generate these intermediates that are damaging O with the single electron, hydrogen peroxide, and hydroxyl radicals. Those can all cause damage, and they cause damage to DNA, to proteins, to lipids, and to cells. Now, the body has ways of preventing that damage, and that's antioxidants like the enzymes like peroxidase, which is very important in preventing atherosclerosis, and GSH was important in protecting proteins from oxidation. And there are damage removal and repair enzymes for DNA and proteins. And if the balance isn't perfect, then you can get oxidative damage, and it's our opinion that in SLE, the damage isn't perfect. I've tried to show you here, this is the relationship between oxidation of proteins on the upper two panels, and the more active lupus is on the X panel, reading left to right, the more oxidation there is of proteins, and the less reduction of proteins, which is shown in the bottom panel. So the more active the disease, the more potential for oxidative damage. We've been interested in oxidative damage to HDL, high-density lipoproteins, which are protective in most people against atherosclerosis and against LDL oxidation that forms the beginning of plaques in arteries. So normal HDL are on the left, and on the right are pro-inflammatory HDL that are characteristic of some patients with lupus, and they are loaded with damaged, oxidized lipids. And there are enough there that they impair the ability of the HDL to have its antioxidant and even its reverse cholesterol transport effects. So this is data from work led by Maureen McMahon in our group, and anything above the black line is an abnormal HDL that's pro-inflammatory. On the right are lupus patients, and you can see that about half of people with lupus have these oxidized, damaged HDL. And on the far right are patients who have carotid artery plaque, and 87% of them have these abnormal HDL. The positive predictive value of this isn't very good, but the negative predictive value is about 95%, so it's really quite good. Now, you've heard about genes and lupus and the epigenetics of genes, and I'm just going to skip right by this in the interest of time, same slide that Dr. Criswell showed. I want to spend a moment about the power of regulatory T cells to prevent lupus. And so this is an experiment also from our group led by Antonio LaCava, where he took a normal mouse on the left-hand column, read from top to bottom. It's a normal glomerulus in the kidney on the top, deposition of immunoglobulin and complement as you read down, and there isn't any. This is a normal mouse. And all Antonio did was deplete regulatory T cells. He depleted CD25-bearing T cells, and CD4 regulatory cells express a lot of CD25, and look what happened. Look at the proliferation of the glomerulus in the top middle panel, and look at the deposition of immunoglobulin and complement. So by taking away this natural protective cell, you can get a normal mouse to develop lupus nephritis. We think the cell is very important. We also have some data, and we'll show you some of it at this meeting, to indicate that men are superior to women, you heard me say it, in the fact that they make more regulatory T cells and they have more FOXP3 per cell than women do. And we think this may be one reason that men are less prone to autoimmune disease than women are, and we're working very hard to see if that's right. Now the therapeutic breakthroughs. And what I want you to do is connect here some of these therapies with what they do not only to adaptive immunity, but innate immunity. So here's mycophenolate, prodrug for mycophenolic acid. It reversibly inhibits IMD, particularly that's required for de novo synthesis of purines, and lymphocytes, especially when they're activated, depend on this pathway, and they're a relatively selective target for this drug. This is a pretty well targeted medication. Therefore, because the lymphocytes can't make purines, this drug inhibits T and B cell proliferation, and it inhibits antibody production, and all of those things we certainly want in the adaptive immunity side. Interestingly, it also inhibits maturation and cytokine release from dendritic cells in the innate immune system. It inhibits adhesion molecules in cell trafficking, not only for lymphocytes, but for neutrophils, the innate immune system. And it inhibits the production of iNOS, and it protects from oxidative stress. So I like thinking about this medication in terms of all of the parts of the immune system it treats. Don't forget that cortisone-type drugs also alter all of these cells that I've talked about and many of the proteins that they make. And that may be one reason that some of these drugs are effective. This is the ALMS trial showing the success. The open bars are the improvement in patients who are taking IV Cytoxan, and the dark bars are improvement in patients who took mycophenolate. This is the NIH high-dose Cytoxan regimen. And you can see that the mycophenolate is not inferior to the Cytoxan in the group overall. And now let's look at ethnicities. Very interesting, very important. In Asians, they're similar. The differences aren't statistically significant. In Caucasians, in the third group, they're similar, not statistically significant. But in other individuals, there is a less good response to cyclophosphamide than there is to mycophenolate. And that group includes African Americans, Hispanics, and people who live in Latin America who were part of this ALMS trial. So that's very interesting in terms of who should get what kind of treatment. To our surprise, since we thought mycophenolate was gentler than Cytoxan, it wasn't in this study. The deaths were about the same, more diarrhea with mycophenolate, more nausea with IV Cytoxan, and one would expect there to be less infertility with mycophenolate. Both of the drugs are very teratogenic, so they can't be used in people who are planning pregnancies if they can be avoided. Now, we're supposed to see data soon, and Dr. Bumpus alluded to this, that say that mycophenolate's better than azathioprine for maintaining improvement once you've induced improvement in people with lupus nephritis. And this is the release. The Lupus Foundation of America praised the results of a new long-term study that shows this. I have not seen the data. A lot of good people have said this is true, and I'm waiting anxiously to see the data, hopefully soon. Recent data from the Ginsler and Appel work shows that MFF works in people with membranous lupus nephritis, which has not been thought to respond as well as the proliferative forms. So it works in that. And they've also shown that in the extrarenal manifestations of lupus, mycophenolate also works as well as cyclophosphamide. I have now learned we may not be using mycophenolate correctly. There are 2 papers out in the last month that show you should measure the concentration of myfortic if you're using myfortic acid or mycophenolate, because that's probably the best way to treat, because people who have active lupus do not achieve the same high levels of myfortic acid in their serum as people whose lupus is more quiescent. So we probably should be pushing harder at the beginning, treating to a therapeutic level instead of looking at how many milligrams we're giving, and probably be able to back off with the guidance of what the level is. 2 papers from 2 different continents with the same conclusion, and they reached the same target. They have recommended the same target, which is 35 to 40 for the level of mycophenolate that you want to see in the serum. So I thought that was probably very useful. Dr. Lipsky showed this slide last night. It's from Thomas Dorner, and it shows the development. What we understand now are breakthroughs about understanding B-cell development. And maybe we should say, let me say in correction, that the transitional cell maturing T1 to T2 and into marginal zone occurs in the spleen of mice. And Dr. Lipsky pointed out last night, we don't know where it occurs in people. If you go to the black box on your far right, these are the major effectors of lupus and of defense against foreign invaders. That's the plasma cell in red there and the memory B cell. The development of these cells, B cells, from transitional into the effector cells, memory, and plasma cells depends very much on BAF and Bliss, and so that is a lead-in to discussing these. Now, I debated between showing you a curve, which is easier to read, and showing the actual data, and I went for the actual data here because there's been some issue about whether this improvement is important enough to be exciting to patients with lupus, and my opinion is that it certainly is important enough to be exciting to all of us. The Bliss 52 study conducted in Asia and Latin America, lupus without active nephritis or active central nervous system disease. 865 people with lupus volunteered for this study. I think that's really quite remarkable. They got placebo, 1 or 10 milligram anti-Bliss IV. the response at 52 weeks by this composite score, and I've listed it there, and Dr. Bayan discussed it last night in detail. 43% of the lupuses on placebo had a good response at 52 weeks, compared to 51.7% on the 1 milligram and 57.6% on the 10 milligram of anti-bliss, mg per kg, that is. And both the 1 milligram and the 10 milligram doses are statistically significant. The first successful trial with a biologic in lupus that we've had in terms of reaching endpoint. The Bliss 76 was done in North America. I show you the response at 52 weeks, 34 versus 41 versus 43, and again, the 10 mg per kg is statistically significant, 1 is not. So 10 mg per kg is going to be the recommended dose, I would think. At 72 weeks, the responses were not significantly different. But this drug has achieved improvement in 2 studies in several different parts of the world with similar designs. There are lots of other B-cell markers that have been treated or are being treated. Why did this one work better? The targets are different. BAFF's very important, as I indicated, in pushing on to the plasma cell. Bliss is made by mononuclear cells, so that it is a product of cells of innate immunity. The use of steroids and immunosuppressives was different. Both were required to be better than effective background therapy. That's a very high bar. I think it's wonderful we're able to see a signal in that setting. The outcome measures are different. Anti-CD20 depletes desirable cells, regulatory Bs, which are also responsible for bringing up regulatory Ts that I talked about. That may be important. Where will TACI-Ig that blocks receptors for BAFF and APRIL fall in this picture? Will it be better? Dr. Lipsky discussed that in detail last night. And anti-IL-6 does deplete some plasmablasts and plasma cells. Will it be better? There's a preliminary study indicating that it may be very good for depleting plasma cells. So now as we look into the future, I want to raise these questions. As we're getting into these highly targeted therapies, are we indeed affecting enough targets with these high targets, highly specific targets? Are we going to need, I think we are, to block both innate and acquired immunity, but not forever? We need to come and go in blocking those. Are we blocking all the effectors of damage and continuing inflammation, like oxidative damage, and should we give more attention to that than it's getting now? So, if I wanted to suppress new active lupus, I'd like to target plasma cells better than we can now, get rid of the antibodies. I'd like to use strategies that alter protein production from genes via taking advantage of epigenetics. I think innate immune cells are going to have to be targeted. They play a major role. And we need to prevent ongoing inflammation and damage by paying attention to oxidative damage and to fibrosis, which I decided I didn't have time to talk about and really don't know anything about anyway. This is an example of a new drug coming into trial. I don't select it because I think it's best, but before going into trial, this is laquinimod, which is a quinolone derivative. The company has shown that it downregulates all the genes in green and upregulates the one in red, and it hits monocyte macrophages, CD8 T cells, CD4 T cells, and subset CD19 B cells and NK cells in ways that should be favorable to shutting down inflammation. So that looks very interesting to me. So these would be our strategies that I think we should think about, and this is my last slide. We should continue to suppress multiple pathways, and we may have to continue with glucocorticoids, MMF, cyclophosphamide, azathioprine, and target additional pathways that are involved in individual patients, which could be B-cell, T-cell, oxidative pathways, et cetera. That's what we're doing now, and we can get better at the later targets. Or we could begin with general suppression and then switch to highly targeted therapies to maintain improvement. And that would be a lot better than we're doing now, because we get rid maybe of the cortisone drugs and the immunosuppressives to go to more targeted therapy. Or, and this would be the absolute ideal, and we aren't there yet. Ask me back in 10 years, and I hope we'll be doing this last strategy. We'll develop multiple highly targeted therapies against these major pathways, and we'll be able to tell in which patient, what's important at what time, and we can target that with probably 1 or 2 different strategies. It won't be just one pathway per flare, it'll be several. And then we can get those pathways shut off, and as others develop or aren't shut off, we can target those, and we'll do this therapy where we select for each person highly targeted control of these damaging autoantibodies and pathways. Thank you very much.